Ambassador, for joining us. So the invitation, really, ladies and gentlemen, if there's sensitive issues that I can't respond to, that probably the former ambassador will be able to respond to, and I know all of you know why. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa, resulting in the shifting of global alliances, contested norms, economic uncertainty, and growing geopolitical tensions. In this dynamic environment, as South Africa, we have to pose the question, ladies and gentlemen, how do we position our foreign policy trajectory to navigate these challenges effectively, enabling us to protect and advance our national interests, and continue to be a key opinion maker in the body politic of international relations. For many, ladies and gentlemen, the uncertainty of the present moment is unsettling. We have seen the retreat and erosion of multilateralism, the resurgence of unilateralism, conflicts that are raging across all continents, and the political and economic fractures that divides the world have created an atmosphere of instability and unpredictability. This symposium, ladies and gentlemen, allow us, therefore, a valuable opportunity to engage on the opportunity dividend that is present, but also to reflect on the pitfalls, characterized, ladies and gentlemen, by a complex interplay of factors, prominently featuring ism and narrow ethno-culturalism in various regions in the world. Secondly, we have seen, ladies and gentlemen, that the resurgence in right-wing movements across various regions has intensified the discourse surrounding identity politics, revealing an urgent need for governance that prioritizes inclusivity and representation has increasingly be accompanied by polarization within societies as marginal groups strive for recognition and equality amidst rising populism. The consequence of these developments, ladies and gentlemen, could manifest as a prolongation or even a deepening of protectionist policies, potentially leading to heightened trade disputes and tariff wars. This trajectory may catalyze a swift departure from multilateral agreements, instead favoring a landscape dominated by bilateral trade deals, prioritizing narrow national interests. Such a shift, ladies and gentlemen, would significantly weaken international cooperation on critical global challenges, including climate change, arms control, and public health initiatives. The impact, ladies and gentlemen, of narrow nationalism extends beyond domestic issues. It has evidently affected South Africa's international image and relationships with countries which prioritize inclusivity and social harmony. As we therefore navigate these challenges, it is crucial to tackle the underlying tensions that narrow nationalism do generate. The consequence, ladies and gentlemen, an ever-increasing presence of technological developments present a double-edged sword. Our foreign policy must consider the complex interplay of technology as both a positive, but if not adequately responded to, as a negative. Historically, we have seen right-leaning movements have utilized state institutions, military force, and religious conservatism to consolidate their power. In our digital age, these movements have found a formidable ally and an instrument in technology, which has the capacity to extend beyond our borders and even reach the more conventional borders. This alliance, ladies and gentlemen, presents itself as a concrete dynamic in the form of your tech oligarchies, which we do anticipate will intensify what I characterize as hyper-globalization for the benefit of a few of the privileged. As digital monopolies increase their prominence, they then, ladies and gentlemen, tend to influence economic policies that primarily benefit a limited segment of society, which approach is in contrast to our philosophy of Ubuntu, diplomacy and human solidarity with the poor and the vulnerable. In the context of the technological advent, ladies and gentlemen, presents an opportunity for rapid advancements that can grow the South African economy. It presents the capacity to boost our own productivity rates and create new job opportunities. On the other hand, the stark digital divide, particularly in the rural areas, which lacks high-speed internet and essential digital skills, pose a considerable threat to equitable progress. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, the impact of technological growth on the labor market cannot be overlooked. Automation and artificial intelligence threatens to displace traditional jobs, especially in vital sectors like mining and agriculture, which are the cornerstones of South Africa's economy. To mitigate these challenges requires government and non-state actors to work in cohesion, to invest in education, and to undertake elaborate reskilling and training programs. International relations, ladies and gentlemen, has always focused on equity. And one of the key considerations of South Africa's triple challenges speaks about the need to reduce inequality. When we speak about security and the nexus with development, ladies and gentlemen, we look at peace and development in the African continent. And peace and development we regard as intertwined. And that's why we refer to it as a nexus, the nexus of development and peace. We have seen the conflicts in the Sahel, Libya, Sudan, in the DRC, and these, ladies and gentlemen, underscore the interconnectedness of security and governance against the backdrop of political economy. The principle that there are no military solutions to complex political and economic difficulties resonates throughout the African continent. It is therefore our submission as South Africa that the original mechanism, including the AU's flagship program on silencing of the guns, becomes the key interlocutor and mechanism, ladies and gentlemen, to ensure that we attain the AU Agenda 2063, which speaks about an inclusive Africa. We have seen, ladies and gentlemen, that a difficulty on self-determination in Western Sahara continues to be unresolved. It is our submission that effective mediation, coupled with adequate funding and robust coordination within your regional economic communities, your RECs, are essential for the resolution of the self-determination struggles of the people of Western Sahara. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a mirror image of our understanding of what needs to be done to ensure that peace diplomacy becomes a permanent reality within the African continent, that the African Union's peace and security architecture can best be served by the strengthened role played by the PSC, the early continental warning system, the operationalization of our own peacekeeping forces and standby forces, and more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, to strengthen the role that our eminent persons and panel of the wise have to play. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all affected by global conflicts that are reshaping not only the African geopolitical landscape, but also that of other regions. We have seen the ongoing war in Ukraine remains a central point of international tensions. While South Africa has consistently re-emphasized its very active non-aligned stance, with the emphasis on dialogue over confrontation, we drew, ladies and gentlemen, over the past 2 years, sharp condemnation and criticism from many in the West. Today, the same countries that have criticized South Africa are actively engaging with us on the next steps to bring about the logical conclusion of the Ukraine. And it is for that reason that President Ramaphosa have announced imminent hosting of a state visit, the President of Ukraine, President Zelensky, to ultimately bring the logical conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, to the war in Ukraine. Furthermore, we have seen the escalating conflict and the enlargement of the genocide by Israel, again, which continues to threaten not only local stability, but also the Middle East peace process. It is our submission, ladies and gentlemen, that our decision to take Israel to the ICJ was not a decision made in haste, it was a decision made in pursuit of justice. And we were conscious, ladies and gentlemen, that the truth comes with a price to pay. And that challenging this current status quo will always invite resistance from those who benefit from it. We wish to emphasize and re-emphasize, as therefore, that our case against the Israeli state is not a case against the Israeli people. It is a defense mechanism to spear the protection of human rights, to amplify the rule of law, and to ensure international accountability on the conduct of the state. Ladies and gentlemen, no discussion on global, international balance of power can be complete without looking at climate change, which we regard as an existential threat to the attainment of your SDGs 2030, which only 70% of those SDGs, ladies and gentlemen, as we speak, has been reached. Having hindsight that it's only 5 years before the conclusion of 2030 SDGs. It is our submission that environmental degradation manifests itself in various forms, including rampant deforestation, alarming biodiversity losses, pervasive pollution, and we have witnessed the ongoing crises, ladies and gentlemen, in Mozambique, in Madagascar, in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, in KwaZulu-Natal because of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our strategic approach, therefore, that our foreign policy will continue to be principled, ladies and gentlemen. Mutual respect for all other member states, adherence to international law, foregrounded in active non-alignment, the deepening of multilateralism through the transformation of global governance institutions, the pursuit of peaceful dialogue, and the pursuit, ladies and gentlemen, an absolute commitment to progressive Africanism and internationalism. These are principles that underpin South Africa's foreign policy trajectory. We'll continue, ladies and gentlemen, to deepen the relationship with your more industrialized North, in particular with the G7 nations, with the European Union, with the Nordics, with the Baltic states, with the UK, with the Middle East and Asia, which presents very unique opportunities for South Africa to recalibrate and strengthen its economic diplomacy. We will do that, ladies and gentlemen, leveraging our international membership in esteemed economic blocs such as your BRICS Plus, through our G20 presidency, which speaks about the central emphasis on solidarity, equality, and sustainability. We'll continue to champion, ladies and gentlemen, the implementation of the Alvin consensus that advocate for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, in particular the veto vote embedded within the P5, and for the representation of at least 2 African states within the UNSC. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, we are confident that our Ubuntu diplomacy, which has been the prelude to the South African Foreign Policy's white paper, will become a force multiplier and a key catalyst as we navigate on behalf of the South African people the very complex and dynamic foreign policy trajectory that we are going to pursue over the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. Please join me in appreciating the remarks by the Deputy Minister. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Honorable. I think the Deputy Minister has done a sterling job in terms of presenting this law that is South Africa's foreign policy. So now we're moving to breaking the bread, slice by slice, in terms of then how is this law get battered in addressing the bread and butter issues as far as the South Africa's foreign policy is concerned. So it gives me really a great pleasure to invite into the podium someone I have engaged with on a number of occasions, dissecting South Africa's foreign policy positions and the program, Gustavo Carvalho from South African Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. I have not done introducing you. I know that time is against us, and we want to get into dissecting these important remarks that was done by the Deputy Minister. Just to mention that Mr. Carvalho is the public policy research and consultant, and who has got a wealth of experience in multilateralism, senior researcher at this African Governance and Diplomacy Program of the South African Institute of International Affairs. So it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to introduce your panel as you'll be leading the panel discussion. So thank you so much. Thank you, my round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Sally, and good afternoon, colleagues. All protocols observed. It's one of those expressions that when you come to South Africa becomes very handy. And thank you, Deputy Minister, and Mrs. Lamini for those really interesting insights that I think is going to be particularly useful for us to reflect in terms of where is South Africa in the world, where is South Africa in Africa, what are some of the challenges the country is facing, but how can we navigate some of those? And I couldn't be happier with the panel that we have here today to discuss those issues. Before I introduce them, just to explain to you how we are planning to engage with this discussion in the next 35 to 40 minutes or so. We're not really going to have presentations from each of the speakers. We're going to engage on remarks, but I would like to welcome the Deputy Minister as well as any other senior DIRCO official that is here. If you would like to respond impromptu to any of the questions, just indicate to me and I'll be able to give you the floor. Let me invite here then my colleagues, and I will invite in the order where they are seated here. I wanted to invite Mr. Priyal Singh. He's a senior researcher at the Africa in the World program within the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. Priyal, please join us here. Second, Professor Ntongi van Niekerk from Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. Thank you so much. And Dr. Faith Madera from the International Relations Department at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Colleagues, once again, thank you very much. And as we were talking before this session, I thought that would be useful for us to address the elephant in the room, which is about United States-South Africa bilateral relations. We all know the events that occurred in the last couple of months in terms of different executive orders, in terms of particularly 1 week ago when our ambassador to Washington was declared persona non grata and recently returned to the country. And I'm going to ask this question to the three of you. I think it would be interesting to get a different perspective. In line with this increasing tension, and perhaps also with the remarks from the Deputy Minister, how do we see South Africa's ability, willingness to recalibrate a bilateral relationship that is important to South Africa, at the same time that maintains South Africa's strategic autonomy within a much more complicated international space? So let me start in this order here. Maybe Faith, can you enlighten us with some thoughts about that? Or maybe confuse us more, that is fine.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think you've started right at the business end of a lot of what is informing media space, debates, and forcing us to ask very important questions that point us to a back-to-basics approach about what foreign policy is. In fact, I think the only other time when we saw such an animated engagement around foreign policy in the South African space was when, at the time that South Africa actually launched its case at the ICJ. If memory serves me correctly, that's when there was that level of engagement and questioning South Africa's orientation, foreign policy orientation and outlook. Now, it begs a question about understanding one. I'm going back to the back-to-basics approach about foreign policy, because by its very definition, foreign policy is it's understanding what the statements, the intents, and a program of action that a state puts out there in response to its external environment, and really informing its approach, its intentions, its policy direction, and its worldview. Not only what it projects out, but also the feedback that it receives from the outside in. That, in essence, is what foreign policy is about. That's what we mean when we say we are studying or analyzing foreign policy, just in a nutshell. Now, if we begin from that premise, the question then boils down to, in really pinpointing that particular incident where we saw the declaration of Ambassador Rasula's persona non grata, and then being essentially told to leave the country, it's just, I think, the tip of the iceberg. I think we need to take a step back and really look at what was building up to that moment. And the argument that I make is that from where I sit, there had been simmering tensions between the US and South Africa for a while. In fact, one can argue that the US was particularly waiting for a moment of transgression with which foreign policy approach. So that presented an opportune moment. It was just unfortunate that it was the South African case in this point. An opportune moment. It was just unfortunate that it was the South African case in this point. Another argument that perhaps we need to really put in the back of our mind is we can't divorce particular events from the larger context about what's happening in the broader sphere, geopolitically and globally, but also South Africa's own internal dynamics. It forces a reapping of the question of what South Africa's national interest is. It forces a questioning of what the ultimate decision-making unit in South Africa is. South Africa, as we are aware, is also in uncharted territory. It's crafting, it's navigating a coalitional government, something that it has not had in this particular scale. And also it's sort of dealing with the implications of having a coalitional government, of being able to navigate the intricacies of having a coalitional government. You're dealing with personalities, you're dealing with political opinions, you're also dealing with your steadfast approach and the ability to actually sustain commitment to what you see as the lodestar of your foreign policy. That's not an easy position for any policymaker to be in. So that confluence of events, I think, is what has led us to this point. And I think it's an interesting entry point into how global South countries need to actually start thinking about foreign policy in the broader sphere.
Thank you very much, Faith. And I wanted to turn to you and Tony. And Faith mentions a lot of issues that I know you spend a lot of time thinking about. What are South Africa's national interests? How do we engage in a changing political environment internationally, but certainly from a domestic point of view? And how do you see those different confluences within the context of the existing and ongoing tension between the United States and South Africa?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I was hesitant to accept because, you know, academics and professors like to think more and not be put on the spot to give instant analysis, which is why I have SAIIA and ISS and IGD, and they do it brilliantly. But let me make 3 points. Maybe the audience will respond. The first, I'm tired of reading yet another analysis of the changing global order. But have we made up our minds? Because this is a perplexing situation we find ourselves in. In fact, I read up the theory of chaos theory, to understand what is happening in politics, international politics today and tomorrow. And I come away with an impression of unpredictability, non-linear developments, and the lesson out of that is we must expect the unexpected. I'm saying this because some analysts and commentators say that if only you understand the Trump administration, you will know what comes next. I'm not convinced that we know, or that the Trump complex and ambiguous, which business schools use, I think is relevant for us today. The second, And I thought that was worth remembering. The third point is, I've got 4. The third one is, let us not reshape or formulate or reorganize our foreign policy approaches, strategies, and principles according to the man in the White House for the next 4 years. There are bigger and deeper processes that we need to understand firmly, and I'm saying this with this picture behind me of the G20. It's not about handing over to Donald Trump in November. It's about much more than that. The last point is this: if we want to do what I'm saying, let's stand up. Well, proud. We have a position to defend. We are a leader in Africa. We are a part of a global South alliance, which is growing in power and influence and strength. That is our role. We understand the shifting tectonic plates. Then the question is, Deputy Minister, do we have the tools and the instruments to do what you say we stand for? And there's a critical set of questions which I will just mention without analyzing them. We have a foreign policy white paper of Ubuntu, 2011. We have a national development plan, which is the expression of our national interests, written in 2013. We've got a national interest framework document produced by DIRCO in 3 or 4 years ago. And we have a national security strategy. In my view, these are the enablers of our national interests. These are the documents, the strategies, the positions, the direction, the roadmaps, if you put them together, that will take us out of the quagmire or the quicksand of rapidly evolving international affairs and give us a focus beyond the immediate. And so it means there's a lot of work, there's a bit of work for us to do. And let me end on another controversial note. As South Africans, do we understand our role in peace? Because many of us believe that's our vehicle. What is our role in peace?
Thank you, and I think perhaps another question, do we understand BRICS? Maybe this could be almost like a next step for it, and society that are engaging with that. Priya, what are your thoughts on that? And I think maybe in terms of the broader question, but also taking advantage of the fact that Faith and Antonio also shared some certain things there.
Well, I think there's 2 levels of analysis here, and we often conflate and confuse the 2. One is, how will South Africa respond to what the Trump administration represents on an international stage as an inflection point for the future trajectory and development of international order? That's one debate. That's one. It's an incredibly important debate for us to get into. How do we position ourselves within this volatile, uncertain, unpredictable world, as Anthony mentioned, this VUCA kind of situation we find ourselves in? But the other issue is the very simple fact of relations between Pretoria and Washington. It should surprise no one, and we should not be surprised moving forward, that we have bad relations with the United States. And we will probably continue to have bad relations with the United States. We would even have bad relations with the United States if Kamala Harris won the last election. We would as Faith mentioned earlier, if we look into this kind of simmering relations that we've shared at a bilateral level for many, many years, it has been one of, yes, on one hand, on certain thematic areas, there has been cooperation, in the JEP and so on. But it has also been one of consistent provocation. Oftentimes, from the South African side, we currently sit here in Johannesburg, in which our city council has been trying to rename Santon Drive for many years, simply as an act of provocation. I mean, it's well documented. There's no other deeper reason there. They want to provoke the United States. They want them to change their letter. So again, we've been constantly poking and poking and poking. And yes, so the point I want to make is when we look at that level of analysis, simple bilateral relations between Pretoria and Washington, we must ask ourselves, what is the game plan? Really, what has been the game plan? Has it been a coherent game plan that we've had? to work with the United States on certain issues, which we've had. With past US administrations, we've been able to compartmentalize certain things. We've been able to say we are committed to progressive internationalism and all of these things, but we're willing to really meaningfully engage with the United States on X, Y, and Z, on the just energy transition, on global health and so on. But I think all bets are off now with the Trump administration. It's more than clear. So when we have this debate moving forward, I think, Gustavo, those are the two levels we need to focus on, and we need to be very careful in not conflating these two issues. The first one that I mentioned, how we react to this inflection point that the Trump administration represents on the international stage, should be kind of a discussion we have in isolation from the more tangible, direct bilateral relationship between Pretoria and Washington that Anthony also touched on.
Thank you. And I think a lot of the reflections here talk about the VUCA. I like that, what you presented, Anthony. It's how do we know where we are in the world right now? There is this discussion around, are we living unipolarity? Are we in a bipolar space? Is it multipolar? Is it multiplex? But I think fundamentally is a high degree of confusion between policymakers, academics, on what is really the current situation that we are internationally. But certainly one of the things, Faith, that we've seen in recent years is an increasing attempt of countries to diversify the international relations. It is clear for South Africa that we can't simply just walk away from the United States. It is a large bilateral partner. There is a number of issues that we are working with very closely. But we start seeing countries like South Africa, like European countries, like many African countries, Latin American, Asian countries, really looking for, well, we need to diversify almost as a risk management issue. We diversify relations to diversify risks. Mm-hmm. And my question to you is, how can South Africa do that? The Deputy Minister mentioned that in his remarks around engaging more with Middle East and Asia, with European countries, with the UK post-Brexit, with Latin Americans, and create this balance that effectively brings benefits to South Africa, without necessarily seeing that as an either-or proposition.
Okay, essentially, the kind of frame your question is, how do we manage foreign policy in the era of uncertainty? It would be remiss for me not to highlight, Professor Tony mentioned VUCA, but I wear another hat where I'm working on a project at this university that focuses on the concept of the polycrisis. In fact, one can argue that we are firmly in the era of the polycrisis. This idea that we have multiple interconnected crises with emerging terms that really the sum of the parts is greater than the individual effects. And that compounding effect is what we are seeing increasingly being shaped around the discussion, not only by the Global Risk Report. In fact, the Global Risk Report as the top 3 risks alongside adverse weather and state-based conflict. Now, with that in mind, it's a question of essentially managing foreign policy in the era of polycrisis, or VUCA, or whichever other term you prefer. If you were to ask me as an analyst offering or policy advisory person offering key points, practical, tangible points to a policymaker, I think I'll boil them to 4. Number 1, for the policymaker in mind thinking about how to shape trajectory of foreign policy in the era of uncertainty, 1, embrace possession. Think causally. So as Priya was saying, try and look at the interconnections of systemic risks and their effects in a widely interconnected manner. One of my favorite theories usually says ideas does not equate to policy. You must go through the motion of actually translating your ideologies, your ideas, your worldview into comprehensible policy positions that you can actually back up or inform with your core principles, your core values, your outlook. Secondly, linked to this is the question of embracing systems thinking. And this boils to one, the nature of complexity and interconnectivity of issues, but also moving away from very reductionist and linear thinking to a systems-based approach. That will then begin to have a very clear outlook on how you navigate the interconnection of crisis, which ultimately has a bearing on foreign policy formation and implementation. Thirdly, for the policymaker at this juncture, you cannot ignore feedback loops. You need to have a particular framework or mechanism in place from which you're able to assess strengths and weaknesses and actually have a dose of humility to actually take back feedback on what strengths and weaknesses are highlighted. And it's only by doing so that you begin to gain clarity and coherence. And thirdly, evidence is the raw material of policy making. So you can't ignore informing your policy from evidence, but also every policy maker at this particular juncture, you must be able to re-immerse yourself in culture, in history, and in current events. And thirdly, embrace the long view. So while I understand that for a lot of foreign policy, particularly crisis foreign policy decision making, tends to be very reactive, very short term in terms of approach, but there must be a willingness to take a step back and embrace the long view of politics. So while on one hand, you must have this dexterity of embracing, moving between short-term approaches and immediate preoccupation, but on one hand also demonstrate a kind of cognitive flexibility in engaging with the long-term view, which is essentially also the knit and match of international relations. So those are the very same, I think, sort of redress or remedial actions that I would put forward for South Africa in agreement with what Anthony said about you can't now begin to take the run-and-mill diplomatic collisions or diplomatic rows and frame them as the everyday happenings. The rows, the diplomatic disagreements happen in everyday occurrences. It's an everyday occurrence in diplomatic circles, but it's actually the art of diplomacy in which you're able to have conversations and negotiations and bring it back to a very sane and sober conversation rather than spectacle and optics.
To add to this, so when a big company faces an uncertain future, dare I mention Tesla, or a big organization, or a government, or a country, or a big university. In fact, I can spend a lot of time talking about how this emerging chaos is impacting heavily on higher education. What do? One tool which I'm beginning to think is really valuable for us in interpreting events and then forging ahead or a road out of it is scenarios which we as South Africans are familiar with. I know they can be technical, but they are also political. In fact, our transition from apartheid to democracy was helped along by the smooth thinking of some scenario planners. Now's the time to do that. And I asked myself, who in government, in our presidency, is working with our top analysts to do that? Maybe there are. I've not heard. But this is where you bring faith into the room and say, repeat your 4 points. So let's build on that. And I want to end on another note. I don't think we are naming or renaming streets or cities to poke the Americans. We do it because we have an inner conviction and a belief in the just cause of other people. Why would your example be one of making Donald Trump angry? I see it very differently. And I don't think we should back off from that.
I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm going to open the floor for a round of 4 questions. So if you're interested, please start thinking about that. But I wanted to bring some of the issues that we spoke now, and particularly one of the areas that, as we heard from Deputy Minister, to be quite important for South Africa, and particularly in line with the idea of multilateralism. We have G20 in South Africa this year, and the pursuit of building a legacy and to build something that is long-lasting, and I really like this idea of futures planning. Both ISS and SAIIA both have dedicated sectors working with this future forecasting and foresights. I just came from the United States, where it's been more and more questioned, less and less credible for many, less and less utilized, but it still remains very important for many of us, for countries like South Africa, for countries within the Global South, for European countries. How do you marry those different tensions, and is that something that a country like South Africa can do? And then I'm going to open it to the audience.
It's a very interesting question, Gustavo. I think, again, I would make a distinction between the very critical and pivotal role that South Africa can play within hard multilateralism. So when we think of multilateral structures like the United Nations, the General Assembly, or Geneva, or even when we relate to the Security Council, the hard multilateralism versus what we would more commonly define as there's a multilateral internal logic to them. But fundamentally, and diplomatic clubs, which operate more along the logic of the geopolitical considerations and the national interests of its specific constituent members, and whether they act in a common interest for all countries is questionable. So I think we'd separate. Moving forward, much more active, robust engagements with working within UN structures. We need more South African faces, governors in Addis, in Geneva, in New York. We need to occupy those halls. The bureaucratic appointments. We need to have our people within those halls, within those rooms, really trying to strengthen and improve the system. Final point, when it comes to G20 and BRICS, I think it's a different case altogether. We should not, again, I think it's up for debate, but I would not want to conflate multilateralism with BRICS and the G20. Within those spaces, I think we need to be more selfish. We have to be more selfish. We're in the G20 and we're in the BRICS as a country to strengthen and to consolidate our position within the international system, and whether we can do that for the benefit of the Southern African region and for the African region in general, I think are added on bonuses. We cannot contribute meaningfully to the development and the security of the Southern African region or the African region in general if we are in a relative state of decline within the Southern African region and the African continent. So we need to take care of ourselves first and foremost within those diplomatic clubs. We are privileged, we find ourselves in privileged positions to be within those spaces, and we need to capitalize and be selfish within those spaces.
Thank you. Let me open the floor to you. Just simple rules of the game. Please introduce yourself, who you are, which institution or country, and so on. And try to make your question as concise as possible. This allows us to have a longer conversation, and if possible, to avoid position speeches if you feel that it's something you really must do. But let's try to continue with the engagement and interaction. Can you raise your hand? I just want to see for now. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to start 5. So I'm going to do 5 questions here, and then I will do another round after. So I'm going to start with the gentleman over there. Thank you. And if we have over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabaso. With a small NGO called IDISA, International Disarmament Initiative of South Africa. So I am I'm disarmament at heart. Again, I'm contesting the person, the elephant in the room is the US. I don't believe that. I believe the elephant in the room is the democratization of information. The ubiquitous of the information, driven primarily by technology, the convergence of technology, including the smartphones, your social media spaces and everything that we have. So for me, that's the elephant in the room, because a layman like me can see what happened in the Oval Office, let's say between President Trump and President Zelensky, and make my own. I'm setting the context. So before, So that's the elephant in the room, the ubiquitous and democratization of information. Because we all have access to information and we can all make up our mind and decide what is right and what's wrong. Right. So my actual point here, the opportunity for South African government, which could be in their toolkit, is really to advocate for President Trump to get a Nobel Prize. I know that's a understanding. Why? Number one, South Africa led in, I said that with the militarist at heart, led in the 4 international disarmament treaties. The Mindbend Treaty, again, on nuclear, because this is where President Trump, pronounced nuclear disarmament again and again and again. Now you have the Pelendauer Treaty, which is Africa, Africa nuclear weapon free zone. Africa as a continent, which was pushed by South Africa. The TPNW, the Treaty to Ban Nuclear Weapons. Again, South African government is leading in that. The Convention on Cluster Munition, what is known as the 2008 CC Act. These are the from Europe. And you hear what President Trump is saying about disarmament. I'm sure we're bound to support the man. Thank you.
Sir?
And sometimes Secretary General of the Association Canada. There is an assault on CARICOM, which is going on, with the demand that CARICOM expel Cuban doctors, or CARICOM leaders will be banned from entering the United States. There's been a deafening silence on what has happened to South Africa. It may be that the Commonwealth is paralysed by the British policy of appeasement of Trump, extreme appeasement of Trump. But I wonder whether you think the Commonwealth now is, in my view, ripe for creative destruction that have been launched.
Thank you. Gentleman there on the back, and then you, and then you. Just right at the back there.
Thank you so much. My name is SAIIA. I'm from Phoenix TV, China. So my question here, or practically the concerns, that do you think that South Africa may need to compromise or to adjust its stance to, like the issue in Israel, its position in BRICS, or etc.? Because as we know, Trump is a businessman and he comes from a business background. In order to deal with him, sometimes you need to do such things. Okay, I'll give you this and I'll take that or whatever. So, or this might be, this is my first part of the question. The second part, or this might lead to a new kind of movement of a just world order that where like things can change significantly.
Then the gentleman here in the middle, then here, and then I'll open again to out.
My name is Kanyis Okadebe. I'm from HWPL. I do have 2 questions, but I think firstly some of them are just comments, and then I'm going to go straight to the questions. I'll try to be as concise as possible. I think firstly just to commend the South African diplomats on the 9 alignment in terms of even the likes of trying to host Ukraine. I think it just shows how South Africa is trying to deal with many issues, what's happening in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And of which I think Mr. Anthony spoke in terms of like defending our stance and our policies. I think that's the work that is recommendable. But now focusing on the non-state actors, I think that's where the question also we need to look at the likes of Africa going to US and so on and so forth, in terms of like how does DERCO engage with the non-state actors, especially also with the organization arena. Is there a way in terms of like such organization when they do such actions that they can be regulated or monitored in a way that whatever action that they are doing may actually harm South African diplomacy? Is there a way on how we can be able to monitor such activities? Because you see that what they go out, I mean, of course, everyone can do whatever, but is that serving the interest and the policies that South African interest wants to serve? And then, of course, also in terms of like DERCO engaging with non-state actors, because I mean, there are surely a number of other organizations that want to engage with DERCO within the policies and also lobbying and other activities. What is their role in the midst of all that? Thank you.
Finally here.
Thank you so much. My name is Vladimir, representing Russian Embassy here in Victoria. Thank you so much, dear panelists, esteemed guests. And my question would come from just as a foreign policy analysis myself, guided by the concept of analyzing national interests and South African national interests and taking the prism of the continental level, the regional level, and the national level. Do you think it is high time for South Africa to update its key documents on foreign policy? I mean, the papers that we've been discussing, they're dated 2010 era, and now with everything re-emerging with the multilateral forums and clubs and organizations, is it high time to update the papers? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of comments, a lot of questions, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. Why don't you, let's go on this order for you to comment, and I have a bonus question after, before I do another round. I was just told that we would be able to go to around 4 o'clock in this format. So, and then after we will go to the Deputy Minister for his remarks. Let me start on that order, just Priya and Tony.
I'll start with the question from the Russian embassy. Sorry, the colleague from the Russian embassy. So, DERCO has numerous foreign policy documents, right? I mean, earlier it was mentioned the foreign policy of Ubuntu, the white paper, the national interest framework documents. I think that was 2018, around that time. These are all good documents. We have good documents within DERCO. We have the Constitution as the guiding light of our foreign policy. The issue for me, apart from obviously the issue that all countries face, is that it's implementation of these documents. The issue for me in South Africa is that our foreign policy establishment is incredibly diverse. Right? It extends beyond DERCO. It extends to political parties. It extends to non-state actors, think tanks, media, and even when we say non-state actors, I mean the diversity and range of actors you find within that field is incredibly diverse and varied. What I feel we need is a realistic appraisal of the political forces that shape our foreign policy, right? Within our broader foreign policy establishment. And for those different nodes of foreign policy making within the broader foreign policy establishments within South Africa to update their documents. It's not necessarily something just for DERCO. It's something for the ANC to consider, for the Democratic Alliance, for all the parties within the GNU. Just by way of example, the international relations of the ANC, certain long-standing elements within the foreign policy as it relates to progressive internationalism, Pan-Africanism, certainly can be updated and brought in line with the current geopolitical realities that we see today. And that, of course, would then filter into Dirko's documents. Maybe just a few other, some of those other points. One was on the Commonwealth. I think for South Africa, where we are right now, it's, regardless of which diplomatic club it is, we need principles enshrined within our constitution, and how much attention and credence we pay to those in the actions of our foreign policy actors within Durban. I think that's the fundamental issue right now. The Commonwealth, I'm not an expert on those issues, but I think so long as the fundamentals are strong when it comes to the normative, ideological, value-based